Russia is attacking not only Ukraine, its drones are flying into the territory of Belarus, Latvia, Romania, and meanwhile, Iranian missiles will soon, apparently, fly into our territory, because this is what Iran very expectedly, predictably also gave to Russia. We will talk about all this and more right now. My name is Irina Uzlova, and David Sharp, a military observer for Israel, is traditionally with us every week. David, hello, we are sincerely glad to see you on our air. Thank you for taking the time.
Hello, Irina.
Friends, a quick note, we are working live on YouTube 24, so if you have questions for David, be sure to write them. I will voice them. I always read your messages. In touch with you. The question arose shortly before our broadcast. What would have happened if Russia had really attacked Latvia? A Russian military drone was found on the territory of Latvia, which entered the country's airspace from Belarus, according to Latvian President Edgars Rinkevics. Yesterday, a Russian military drone crashed in the eastern part of Latvia. An investigation is underway. We are in close contact with our allies, Rinkevics noted. Adding that there are more and more such incidents on the eastern flank of NATO and they need to be solved together. And some of our viewers write that now the whole of NATO would already be on its ears, or is this alleged bloc not so cohesive? Apparently, viewers from the Russian Federation are wondering, is it true, when, how many more NATO countries and how deep, David, should these drones fly? And what harm needs to be done so that NATO is on its ears, and does not hold consultations, not even on the 5th, not even on the 4th, but it is generally not clear on which ones.
When a bloc or a country is not inclined to seriously escalate, they do not look for a pretext for it. Moreover, even when certain reasons exist, they try to downplay their importance. In other words, this is a traditional approach, which, by the way, is valid everywhere, in different regions and at different times. Obviously, NATO does not seek escalation on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are incidents of this kind when a small reconnaissance drone, and most likely it is not a shard, that attacked Ukraine, although I am not sure about this now, but it is something, most likely of a reconnaissance nature, flew somewhere and violated something. Traditionally, this kind of incident, when someone is not looking for, literally, a war or a military clash, cause concern, cause certain measures, but do not cause such steps that would lead to something extraordinary. Let me remind you that even during the Cold War, the first one, today, by the way, we can talk about a real Cold War of a new type, the Cold War between NATO and Russia. So, the Soviet Union and NATO, and the Warsaw Pacts with NATO, there were border violations, there were also fights, and on both sides, well, let's call it that, with an element of provocation. They are taking place now, and, by the way, before the current events of recent years, and Russian planes flew where it was not necessary, and to the Baltic countries, and so on and so forth. That is, it is not customary to react too sharply to events that are not a clear attempt either to unleash a war or to go beyond certain limits, so there is no need to be surprised here. On the other hand, NATO countries should not be underestimated. NATO countries will take certain measures to control and suppress such incidents, including, perhaps, at some stage, the interception of such aircraft, drones, everything has its time. But when they are not looking for escalation, they react accordingly. And it is also important to understand that minor incidents of this kind are more or less common practice.
Okay, but Russian drones also flew into Romania, which flew in order to bomb us once again. Fragments of missiles also fell on the territory of Poland, on the territory of Romania. We remember all this. When will this not minor escalation take place? What measures can they take at this stage to stop this for the future? Because, well, how is the escalation? This is invested in the defense of these countries and ours too.
Each country considers the situation based on its own interests and capabilities. Interest, of course, as I have already said, is a statement of fact. Maybe they don't like it, maybe they like it better, but they don't want an escalation, and they don't want it to look like they are somehow involved in a war with Russia. It is true that when there is a violation and some kind of threat over their airspace, they have a full, and not just moral, right to prevent this threat. And here everything rests on desire, and here it is not even a matter of escalation, it is also a matter of opportunities. In order to do this, they must have forces, whether they are fighters, whether they are ground interceptors in the immediate vicinity of the borders on high alert on a permanent basis, or at least at night, when they are bombing, when they are striking Ukraine and waiting for their chance. If they had such a desire, a very big one, then, apparently, either we would have already come to this, or we will come to this in the near future. On the other hand, they understand, and this must be stated as a fact, that, most likely, yes, they cross the border, say, Romanian, but they do not pose a real threat to Romanian territory. By the way, it can spill out in their faces, as they say, fall somewhere wrong, people will die or something will happen, and then, most likely, the attitude will change. But so far, the approach is this. Yes, it makes some kind of detour, touches our territory, on the other hand, that we will keep the F-16 in 24/7 readiness in order to possibly intercept it while it is there 500 meters. I put myself in their place. I violated our border. Apparently, they do not have such a desire. This requires a lot of effort for such a country and promises some trouble if suddenly it does not happen quite so. Starting from the fact that something can be shot down over Ukrainian territory, and fly into Ukrainian territory, and suddenly there will be claims from the Ukrainians. In general, I am just trying to list something on their behalf. But the main thing is when you don't want an escalation, when you don't want unnecessary problems, when you don't want to bring these problems on your own head. This is the approach.
If you don't invite trouble, it won't come to you. Therefore, apparently, NATO countries do not want to shoot down Russian missiles over our territory. We have already begun to mention this indirectly. Dutch Defense Minister Ruben Breckelsman says that this will also be the risk of escalation, almost a direct clash between NATO air forces and Russia. Breckelsman notes that it is necessary to look for creative ways, which we also mention. In each case, you need to weigh whether the benefits outweigh the risks. Like, what will it give? Such a solution will literally cover several kilometers of a small area. To protect against Russian missiles, you will still have to use combat aircraft, and this will not give anything. And will this really do nothing for our neighbours to shoot down Russian missiles over the western regions of Ukraine, or does it again return to the answer to our first question? Why don't they want to shoot down Russian air targets over their territory?
They would have started shooting over their territory. Sooner or later, I believe that if there were deep spans, they would be ready, really ready. But in fact this readiness needs to be created. It does not exist automatically. A few F-16 planes to intercept something near the border must be on round-the-clock duty, on takeoff, very close to these places. That is, in fact, it is not always easy to have time to intercept an air target that has entered your territory for 10 minutes, if you are at all on the other side of the country and are not particularly prepared. That's one thing, but on their own territory, if we assume that Shaheds fly deep into Romania and Poland regularly, then they will be shot down sooner or later. But here, when we talk about the downing over Ukrainian territory, here the situation is radically different. And here we are, if we talk about it, they have time, they don't have time, they don't really want it, they want more, it's clearly about interfering in the course of hostilities. Something that NATO categorically does not want as a bloc. That is, maybe individual countries were ready in such a limited mode, the Baltic countries say, again, even the Poles said something out loud, but what is important here is a collective decision of NATO, literally. And here, since they do not want escalation, everything is clear and clear here. They will not dare to do this. It could help Ukraine, if we are talking from a technical point of view. If we say that NATO fighters do not fly into Ukrainian airspace, but anti-aircraft missile systems work, for example, from Polish territory, and fighters shoot down something over Polish territory on the territory of Ukraine, this could give certain advantages in covering a number of border zones in western Ukraine. Yes, that would be good, but the problem is that this is certainly an issue that is extremely problematic for NATO, as opposed to the individual drones that penetrate their territory. There is no clear place for them yet, since this is the same escalation.
It turned out to be much more, but yes, Iran is also escalating by transferring ballistic missiles to Russia. In the United States, however, they also say, yes, escalation, but I doubt that they will do anything about it. More on that later. So far, official Iran denies everything and says that we are not there, we were not there, and our missiles are not there either, and the Shaheds, probably, were not there either. Of course, we have no doubt about the hundreds of thousands, probably, of the technology that they transferred. Iranian MP Ahmed Bashaish Ardestani admits that the country has equipped Moscow with ballistic missiles. They say what to do, what to do. It can't be worse than now. We are giving rockets to Hezbollah, Hamas and the Hashd al-Shaabi. So why not give them to the Russian Federation? You see, they need to import soybeans and wheat, and barter to meet their needs. And for some reason, of course, I am inclined to believe it more than official Iran, which always says that we have nothing to do with it at all. How likely is it that, as the Times wrote and calculated, more than 200 ballistic missiles went from Iran to the Russian Federation? Why did Iran take this step, and what did Russia give it in return?
Iran, official Iran, this is time-tested, cannot be trusted, of course, and specifically in the cases of the Shaheeds, because there were also official denials. It is important to believe the facts and, as they said in the classics, your shameless lies. At the moment, we have a report from the world's leading media, based on sources in the special services, who unequivocally or almost unequivocally state that it is not only about negotiations, but that the missiles have already been transferred. At the same time, a specific type of missiles is discussed, and I would not be so sure that it is limited to this type. We are talking, briefly for viewers who are not yet aware, about FAT-360 missiles. In general, Iran has a lot of different missiles of all ranges, different types and degrees of accuracy. From 7 kilometers to, apparently, 3. I'm talking about ballistic missiles now. They also have cruise missile. 3 and something thousand kilometers of range, starting from 7 kilometers. So, the FAT-360 has a range of 120 kilometers, a warhead of 150 kilograms. And what's important, pretty decent accuracy. That is, maybe, by Western standards, it cannot be called a classic high-precision weapon, but this something, I would call a very accurate missile at the request of the manufacturer, an accuracy of 30 meters. An explanation is important here. 30 meters accuracy implies that half of the ammunition will be placed in a circle with a radius of 30 meters, where the target is considered the center of the circle, and another 40 with a small percentage lies in a circle with a radius of 60 meters, but further than 30 meters. This is the center of the circle. So, moreover, the Iranians, these are not empty words. Most likely I do not know about this particular missile, but with other missiles they proved on the battlefield, including in hostilities in the Middle East and against the Kurds, that the missiles are accurate, have such accuracy, and have a long range and a large warhead. And this means that such types of missiles pose a serious danger when firing at specific objects, for example, a large house. And if you shoot in pairs, then even more so smaller targets. Naturally, such important facilities, they're stationary ones, such as, for example, anti-aircraft missile systems, radars of various kinds. It is obvious that Russia really needs them, because Russia does not have a shortage of ballistic missiles. There are, in fact, Iskanders. There are various kinds of multiple launch rocket systems. This missile occupies an important niche, allows you to shoot more at frontline targets and relatively frontline targets, and allows you to save Iskanders and use them for more distant targets. This is, for example, what will the Iranians get? Well, what is there, whether he gave out, I say in quotation marks, a military secret or not a military secret, the same deputy actually has nothing to do with the case. Maybe yes, maybe not, but the general meaning is different for countries, for Russia, for Iran. By the way, unlike its actions in the Middle East, confronting Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States and so on, Iran actually has nothing against Ukraine. That is, this is purely business, in fact, but business is vital for Iran, because getting anything from Russia, and anything, it can be wheat and rye, it can be money, it can be gold, and, of course, weapons and technologies of various kinds. All this is important. Iran is transferring to Russia what Russia lacks, and Russia does not have enough missiles, drones, and, by the way, all kinds of ammunition. Ammunition also came from Iran to Russia, they just talk less about it. So, Iran and Russia need a lot from each other, and Iran is ready to sacrifice relations with Ukraine for this, of course, and even be subjected to additional light sanctions from the West and the United States. Why light? Because, unfortunately, this is what it is. Sanctions. A long time ago, since the Biden administration took over, a significant part of the sanctions on Iran were lifted. This was in terms of the Iranian nuclear program, in the context of the nuclear program. Because of the supply of Shaheeds, serious sanctions were not imposed on Iran, a more symbolic alignment was imposed, very simple. Iran, like any country in any case, weighs the pros and cons. And the moment they see that the advantages of mutually beneficial cooperation with Russia exceed the disadvantages of sanctions from the West as a whole, they choose the side of the pluses. So what could prevent Iran from doing so is suffocating sanctions in this direction and in many others where Iran is extremely problematic and a threat to the world or to other countries, as well as the threat of the use of military force by the United States. But the latter is not in the vocabulary of the current administration at all. Although there were other times, not from this administration. And, of course, we do not see suffocating sanctions either, although there is a stir and probably some sanctions will be adopted. But let's see how they affect Iran.
And this, for example, a batch of 200 plus, as I understand it, can only be the beginning of the word at all. If Iran has so many types and capabilities to produce not only ballistic missiles, then Russia will use them on the battlefield, and, possibly, these other modifications, firing at the civilian population, our fall, winter, on infrastructure. This is such an extension of genocidal tactics.
Perhaps, regarding the number, let's start with the fact that, of course, for the sake of a few dozen such missiles, they would not trifle, unless this is a trial batch. As for thousands of missiles, unlike Shaheds, these are more complex products, I would not say expensive probable, although Shahd is not cheap. There were leaks that Shahd at the initial stage cost Russia $153,000 in bulk purchases. But such missiles are not churned out by many thousands. Moreover, Iran certainly needs them itself, in particular its Iranian allies, when a major war between Israel and Hezbollah is on the doorstep. These kinds of missiles, not necessarily specific, the Iranians have other similar ones. Their allies need it. Therefore, Iran, of course, must, as they say, calculate its steps. And this applies to other ammunition too. But the mass production of missiles and various kinds of ammunition in Iran has been established quite seriously. Moreover, Russia has been interested, since 2022, seriously interested in certain Iranian missiles. And this gave the Iranians time to expand production somewhere, to replenish stock somewhere. So I think that hundreds a year of this kind of missiles, a few hundred a year, and then more if you want, these are real numbers, but we are hardly talking about thousands of missiles in a short time. It is almost unbelievable. However, hundreds are painful, it is problematic. As I said, we are talking about a fairly accurate missile and a fairly heavy warhead. For what purposes can Russia use them, both military and civilian? Another thing is that, since the missile is not very cheap and relatively accurate, just launching it from just like that on a Ukrainian city on the principle of who God sends, as is done with other missiles, even with such tactics, in my opinion, is unreasonable. With their tactics, from their point of view, it would be reasonable to hit some specific target that they want, and quite energy infrastructure facilities that fall within this range, and some large buildings, or something like that. Everything is a theoretically possible target. What can I say here? 120 kilometers in range. This means that if the missile is not launched from the front line itself, including to avoid risk, then theoretically it is possible to launch it from 5 kilometers from the front line to 110 kilometers. The maximum range is too much, but it is more realistic to launch it from a depth of 70-80 to 90 kilometers from the front line, respectively, to avoid risks. Ukrainian targets, both civilian and military, which turn out to be stationary, I emphasize, firing at stationary targets, can be a target for these missiles and undoubtedly will, unfortunately.
David, will there be an answer? We have already understood that the sanctions have been weakened at all, and it is not a fact that stronger ones will return. But is it possible to respond to the supply of ballistic missiles from Iran and Russia, as we and the head of the office of the President of Ukraine Andriy Yermak propose? And in general, it would seem that there should have been a response to many other atrocities and actions of dictators and aggressors. The supply of ballistic missiles to Russia should prompt a response allowing strikes on missile warehouses with Western long-range weapons. Despite ongoing discussions, no decisive action is expected before November 5 or possibly January, even with the escalation from Russia's missile transfer.
About this, of course, these kinds of steps, which can sometimes be answered, because the ATACMS was also to some extent transferred in response to certain actions. And in general, many of these kinds of removal of barriers by the Americans took place against the backdrop of various negatives. Including because of the horrific events, when civilians were killed due to Russian strikes on infrastructure, it was decided to quickly transfer the Patriot systems. Yes, maybe the Americans will allow it, but, to be honest, I have a dead-end assessment of the administration's actions in this regard. That is, for them it has always been the last month and a fundamental moment. Not to allow the use of an attack, but indirectly from storm shadow far from the Russian borders, even against military targets. But these kinds of steps push them to change their minds. And on the other hand, before the elections, they usually do not like to change the decision, because it is important for politicians not to harm the election campaign by a single gram. Come what may. So, after the election, this is an interesting point. Even if the Biden administration changes, no matter who wins, Harris or Trump, the Biden administration ends its cadence a month after the election. And here, at least, this electoral restriction disappears for her, and she can feel President Biden and his entourage, so to speak, more free to act as they see fit. And then those who inherit them will figure it out. Moreover, if it is Harris, then it is clear that we are talking about a consistent transfer of power. If Trump, then things are different. That is, after the elections, the chances can be assessed as purely theoretically higher. If the use of Iranian missiles follows now, I do not rule out that the restrictions will be partially lifted, at least, for example, because it was reported that the Ukrainians handed over a list of targets, a limited list of targets that they asked to hit. Maybe there will be such a permit. In general, this kind of steps by Iran, yes, bring Iran and Russia closer. If you can see something positive in this, then this brings you closer to the lifting of restrictions and some additional supplies from the West. Yes, it brings you closer to some extent. But in the end, we need a political decision, political will, and until we see this, we can talk about this more optimistically, less optimistically. As for the missile depots, I just want to note that, of course, theoretically, when the restrictions are lifted, of course, it is possible and the depots will be, if they suddenly find themselves in the zone of destruction of missiles, and there is information about this, then yes, of course, they will be a priority target. But do not expect that the Russians will easily set themselves up in this way and deploy the same Iranian missiles so that they can be easily destroyed by ATACMS. This is not excluded, but it is not necessary, to put it mildly.
David, the Institute for the Study of War write that, despite waiting for permission to launch long-range strikes against Russia, the Russians have already moved 90% of their aircraft away, but still 209 out of 245 military installations remain within range of ATACMS, Storm Shadow, Scalp EG and their equivalents? Is this really the case, and to what extent will even the time delay still not beg for the effectiveness of when this permission will be granted?
As far as can be judged, indeed, there is a relocation of aviation from the airfields, partially or completely, although not completely, judging by some points. This, by the way, is also related to drone strikes, and not only to the possible potential for the use of the means that you have listed, which are enough. If we are talking so, roughly speaking, about a radius of 250 kilometers from the border, we should always talk not about the maximum ranges, when a conditional Ukrainian missile system drives up to the border itself and launches the maximum range directly from the edge. That is, you need to look a little narrower, let's say, 250 kilometers or something like that. There are a lot of important Russian facilities related to air defense, basing, logistics, and so on. I'm not even talking about objects of an economic nature, which the Ukrainians would gladly attack, but here, apparently, everything will be bad with permits even at best. So, there are enough objects. Some of them were probably not evacuated, some are very difficult to evacuate. Even the partial measures that Russia has already taken, just in case, they should proceed from the consideration that suddenly permission has already been given or it will be given tomorrow, but the New York Times will not write about it. And then the missiles will arrive suddenly, as has happened more than once in many places. Therefore, of course, they must take measures from their point of view. I don't know what they did there. In the past, they were repeatedly burned by the fact that they did not remove the targets, let's say, did not remove the targets from the affected area. But there are more than enough goals. And even in the case of late authorization, and even if the planes are not under attack, the Ukrainians will have many important options in the event of such decisions. But all that remains is to wait for them.
David, can we say that the 8th day has passed since the stop of the Russian offensive in the Pokrovsk direction? Could this be a long-term trend and one of the biggest successes in stopping the Russian occupiers, who have recently been actively advancing in eastern Ukraine? What do you think played a key role at this stage and what factors made it possible?
It is too early to draw far-reaching conclusions. I rely here, among other things, on the most serious Ukrainian sources, including those who are fighting on the ground. Yes, apparently, the Ukrainians have introduced certain reserves that are counterattacking. We are talking, in particular, about the Kursk direction, where Azov counterattacked, improved their positions in some places and withdrew the Ukrainian armed forces from the encirclement. However, in the Pokrovsk direction, it is very early to say that the situation has stabilized. A significant threat remains in the southern flank of the Pokrovsky direction. This is Seladov, this is Ukrainsk. There is a threat of encirclement of the forces, which are at least operational encirclement, which are located on the salient in the Nevelskoye area. There are problems near Vuhledar, this is quite the south of the Kursk region. Again, the entire southern direction, if the movement to Pokrovsk itself seemed to have stopped, then in its southern flank serious problems have not gone anywhere. Stabilization and successes, or failures, are measured in the relatively long term. When everything is very fresh and the fog of war still reigns, it is too early to draw conclusions, whether they are pessimistic or optimistic. But the fact that the threat there is still very significant and specifically on the southern face, this is beyond doubt, and we continue to look at what is happening.
Do you think Russia is already drawing conclusions, or is it also observing? Will it throw more manpower into its combat-ready units and not only? Or will they also take such an expectant pause for now?
They are not quite on pause, they are trying to encircle somewhere and oust forces from the south in the first place. From their point of view, no one has cancelled the priority of this area, and therefore everything rests on reserves. And also, if they have such information, this is already the level of intelligence, to know how many reserves, manpower, units and subunits they have. They will act in those places and others where they see prospects. It is important to understand that in other places where very serious fighting is taking place, for example, Chasiv Yar and the same Kursk, the Russian command takes into account the facts implying that the Ukrainians sometimes take reserves from these directions and transfer them to priority ones, in particular, in a circle. And if somewhere the Ukrainian forces have weakened due to the transfer to more priority areas, in the place where it has weakened, they can put pressure. Again, however, it would be important then to press with something. But we are witnessing these actions, this kind of approach repeatedly. And therefore, the transfer of reserves from one area to another is always fraught with risks.
British intelligence chief William Beards and CIA director Richard Moore co-authored an article in the Financial Times and spoke together at a Financial Times event. And there they noted the success and very good effect that the Kursk operation named after the defense forces of Ukraine had. They say that it showed that there are no red lines. In general, there is no need to be afraid of the aggravation of the situation with weapons from the Russian Federation, but at the same time, Russia continues provocations and uses various cynical technologies to sow discord among our allies. It is important not to succumb to this and continue to support the course of support for Ukraine without change. At the same time, this Russian intelligence has degraded, and the Kursk special military operation has had an effect on the so-called elites around Putin. And did this really have an effect not only foreign policy and military, but also internal, creating an imbalance and staggering when Putin's entourage, including the military, saw that he was not so powerful?
First of all, I don't think that for many, especially in Putin's entourage, their eyes have been opened to something. Those who are surrounded adjust them. It doesn't matter what they say in public, but if they are people with their heads on their shoulders, they roughly understand. They, of course, are in their own minds, but for themselves they more or less understand both weaknesses and some advantages. Although, I don't know, maybe she opened someone's eyes up there. It opened up something to many. I think that it opened the eyes of many people below, especially to residents of the Kursk region and not even the border settlements themselves. And I will remind you that only 1150 people were evacuated, mainly from the Kursk region, and not only there, from Bryansk and Belgorod too. So, there are evacuees, there are those who live nearby, there are members of their families all over Russia. That is, it is absolutely obvious that many hundreds of thousands were directly affected by those events, and this clearly affected these people. Whatever they say to themselves and convince themselves of is not what they consider normal, and not what they expected, and what they assumed could happen to them. So there have been some upheavals in some places, and there are many such people on a personal level, but it is important to understand that we are still talking about the outskirts of Russia, and no one has cancelled Russian propaganda.
Важно понимать, что речь идет все равно об окраине России, в общем-то, и что российскую пропаганду никто не отменял.
And accordingly, when Russian propaganda belittles the significance of the event, when it does not pay much attention to it, but is focused on something else, and it can be an advance in the Donbas or imaginary losses inflicted by Ukrainians in the same Kursk region, and does not pay due attention to it at all, for example, in a democratic country, such a situation would cause a serious stir and this excitement would be a priority in terms of news. However, Russia confidently and deliberately directs propaganda in the right spirit, so the impact of events on the Russian population is less. Nevertheless, those who follow the war and ideological supporters understand approximately what is happening, to put it mildly, and those who are not alien to the news too. So there is a certain influence, but in a country where everything is controlled by such propaganda resources, it is important to understand that the influence is limited.
Yes, a miracle is unlikely to happen there in this aspect, but we will help change the situation. David, thank you very much for these comments, as always professional and relevant. Thank you for your time, for your position. We are holding together to victory. Take care of yourself.
Thank you. My best wishes and a good evening.
Thank you too, David Sharp, Israeli military observer. I am Irina Azlova. Friends, thank you for spending this time with us this Sunday evening, September 8th. Thank you for your attention. Please leave your comments in the same way when you watch the recording. Please like our conversation and subscribe to YouTube channel 24. Your actions help our conversations progress smoothly. Take care of yourself, believe in the armed forces of Ukraine. See you and win.